I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual. 起立，念上佛堂，参加先鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位的传世一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。
Let's take a look at 75. So I find that when you're just looking at this, even though this is what you're looking at right now is already a vast improvement of what I have seen in most of the books out there, including my own, and that is we have the Chinese ancient characters side by side with the modern English translation. But just looking at it here, you can see, just reading this chapter exactly as it is in the English presentation, you can see why people would think that the Tao Te Ching is cryptic or hard to understand. It's oftentimes extremely helpful when we're able to divide it up into different sections and then talk about the sections in sequential logic. So that's what we did last time, and here's what I showed you last time. So the way that it's laid out, the way that 75 is structured is in 3 parts, each part having 3 lines. So 3 times 3 gives you 9, so that accounts for the first 9 lines, and then we have 2 lines for concluding remark at the very end. So before we get into the example, what I want to do, the most important thing that I can do for everyone is to make sure that you understand the 3 parts, what I would call the 3 major points or the 3 main points from Lao Tzu for this particular chapter. And when you are able to thoroughly understand the points, I want to run through an exercise with you to make sure that your complete understanding can translate to an ability to apply the Tao in everyday life. That's really the secret of the Tao Te Ching, the ability to understand what it's saying, understand the patterns that it's pointing out, and then turn around and immediately apply it into your life. So that's the goal today. It's a challenging goal, so I'm going to challenge everyone to stick with me and pay close attention to the way that the first 3 points will be explained, and then run through some examples in your mind, see if you can pick out some examples from your own life. So let me explain what I mean by that. Just looking at the 3 parts 1, 2, and 3, that span lines 1 all the way down to 9, just by looking at the translation itself, here's what we can pick out of the 3 main points. First one starts talking about the people's hunger, then the difficulty in being governed, and then the disregard for death. So I want to point out a progression there. The idea is that these are sequential. We can talk about them out of sequence, but in the presentation from Lao Tzu, he begins by talking about how the people in the kingdom go hungry, and then they become difficult to be governed, they become resistant, and then finally, in the last stage, they become rebellious. They openly disregard the penalty of death, rising up against the ruler. So I want you to notice there's a progression from the initial hunger to resistance to rebellion, open rebellion. And the causes for the 3 different parts starts out being the excessive taxation, then goes into meddling from the ruler, and then the ruler's glut in the pursuit of life. So these indicate the different levels of indulgence in the material world, different pursuits in the material sense. And the last line in this section basically reinforces the first line in that section. So in the first section, you've got starve, that reinforces hunger. And the line number 6 is a reiteration of line number 4, that the people are difficult to govern. And then in a similar way, you can see the structural similarity from between 9 and 7, the disregard for death. So those are the 3 major points. Now the big challenge, the one challenge that many commentaries miss is that, well, now that you see that Lao Tzu is talking about the relationship between the king and the subjects who are ruled by the king, how do we map that? How do we relate that to real life? So that was the basis. That was the majority of the contents that I went over last time. Now, this is an important enough point that I've decided to create 3 additional slides to summarize the 3 major points. So let me share them with you. Here's main point number 1. So it's drawn from lines 1 and 2. So what happened to line 3? Well, as I just mentioned, line 3 is a reinforcement of line 1. The last line reinforces the first line in each subsection of this particular chapter. So here, we've got the hunger, we've got the excess taxation. So we can now see that this is talking about an ancient context of monarchy, of ruling, the absolute ruler, basically lording over people. And let me also explain what I have here in the Chinese. So I've got 2 characters here, 古代. That means ancient times. And then the 2 additional characters here, 君王, that means a ruler. So this could be a reference to a king or an emperor. What is the difference between a king and the emperor? Well, it's really a difference in scale. The king, of course, rules over a kingdom. Now, once the many different states, competing kingdoms have been unified into an empire, the figurehead, the ruler, the absolute ruler over the empire is, of course, the emperor. So it's a difference in scale. But in either case, whether over the empire or over the kingdom, the ruler is an absolute ruler with absolute powers. In the West, we of course know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So this appears to be depicting a scenario of that, beginning with the king imposing too much tax, and remember this could be emperor also. Then the people starve as a result of too much tax, and this goes into a vicious cycle. And what I mean by that is that the more people starve, the less they have. It's a symptom of them having increasingly less to eat, to live, to survive. So they have even less ability to pay the tax from the king or the emperor. So dissatisfied with the take that the people aren't yielding a whole lot for the royal or the imperial coffers, the king or the emperor decides to double down on that policy and extract even more, like squeezing blood from rock. So it gets worse and worse, and this is talking about the beginning of that. Now, it's important for me to point out that this is not Lao Tzu saying that the king or the emperor should not tax at all. So being realistic, Lao Tzu, like the other sages in ancient times, they were quite well aware that in order to function, the kingdom or the empire has to run on something, has to have some resources, has to be able to, form a military force to protect itself, has to be able to build infrastructure, has to be able to maintain law and order. All of these require resources. And therefore, a certain amount of tax is unavoidable. So I hope you can see that this part is just talking about the excess, the extreme. when the taxation gets to be too much. So with that in mind, with all of these points in mind, we are now ready to map everything that I have just talked about into a modern context, the context of your life. This is the part that I often find is not really talked about, not really brought up in the commentaries that I have studied, not mentioned by any of the authors of the books that are out there. So I believe this is something important that we really ought to cover right now. Okay, so side by side, I have set up another column. Now I'm going to, in a similar way as I did to the left-hand column, talk about the four characters that you see here. So if you recall, these two characters over here mean ancient times. So over here, I've got two characters meaning modern times. So ancient times, modern times, the Laozi, the world of Laozi compared to your own world, the fortunes of the empire compared to your own life. So that's how the metaphor works. So rather than a focus on the ruler, the king or the emperor over here on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, the focus is spirituality, specifically your spirituality. So when it says the king imposes too much tax, map it to what I have here on the right-hand side. That's like someone putting way too much emphasis, way too much importance on money. So the pursuit of money by itself is not a bad thing, but it can be taken to an excess. When it's taken to an excess, that's bad news for pretty much everybody. So specifically, when you place too much importance on money, when you're pursuing, a raise at the office, at work, asking for a raise, competing with other people, trying to get ahead of everyone else in terms of your sales quota, whatever the case may be, the pursuit of money, if you focus too much on that, it's always at the expense of your spiritual self. And that is because we only have a certain amount of time per day to devote to either material pursuits or spiritual pursuits. The ideal situation is to have the right balance between the two. But when you are chasing after money too much, it can only come at the expense of your own spiritual cultivation. Therefore, the spirit starves. So the people starving is a metaphor for the starvation of your spirituality. Now, here's a point that I'm going to come back to later on, a very important point. So someone looking at this might say that, well, okay, in this metaphor, are you the king or are you the subjects? Make up your mind. It seems like you're mixing it up. The answer from the Tao sage is going to be yes. So you might say, well, yes to what? Yes, the king? Yes, the people? And the sage would again say yes. The answer is simply yes. The metaphor operates on multiple levels. It also operates at the level of oneness or unity, which means that you need to have the mental fluidity to switch back and forth among those possibilities, and also the profound understanding that ultimately, at the level of the Tao, all are one. Therefore, you can stand in for the king or the emperor. You can also stand in this case, your spirituality can also stand in for the subjects or those who are being ruled. Your spirituality is what suffers when your rational mind, thinking that you need more money, or your ego-driven pursuit of material wealth is in command. Hope that makes sense. So you are both. You are the kingdom, you are the king, you are the subjects. You are all of the above. In the same way, it gets into a vicious cycle. Now, we've seen this. You've seen this in friends, family, people you know, friends of friends. That is, there are always those, the go-getters, the A-type personalities, the hard chargers, people who go after material things like an animal. So they take pride in that. They consider themselves to be the kind of people who can get things done. They are the ones that deliver results, etc. Now, when they do so at the expense of their time for more important things like family, friends, and themselves, time alone for reflection, then you begin the vicious cycle. They get more and more starvation of the spirit, which brings about a feeling of dissatisfaction that is rather vague but always there. So in order to not feel that, they throw themselves into their work even harder. They pursue money even more, thinking that perhaps that's where the dissatisfaction is. So that particular solution is ill-timed and ill-aimed, so that they end up with even more dissatisfaction, which reflects the hunger of the spirit. So all of this is not to say that we should abstain from the pursuit of money completely. Well, that's not what the Tao is about. The Tao oftentimes has been mistaken to that people would think that, well, if you are cultivating spirituality, then you should not be so concerned about money at all. In fact, you should be like a hermit. You should be divided. You should be isolated from the pursuit of material things, period. The real sages, the real cultivators of the Tao will tell you, not so. That isn't true. The Tao is about the balance. In this case, the balance between the material and the spiritual, or the sacred and the secular. And that's here at the temple, in Chinese, in Mandarin, that's oftentimes what people will say. 圣凡兼修. 圣 is the sacred, 凡 is the secular. 兼 both, 修 cultivate. So you can literally map that character by character, word by word into English, and it will go like the sacred and the secular both should be cultivated. That's exactly what we're saying here. So notice that in order to live, in order to function in society, in order to be an individual, fulfilling your potential, etc., you still have to make a living. This is not telling you to discard all of your material belongings, to give up everything, renounce the world. There are some branches of spiritualities that advocate that. I am here to say that they are simply wrong for the vast majority of people out there. So this is main point number one. Remember, taxation, think of tax as money. Starvation, think of that as what the spirit hungers for. When it's lacking spiritual sustenance, it's going to hunger for that. And then moderation, there has to be a balance between the two. You cannot simply disavow all activities that generate a way for you to make a living. Now, think of it this way too. When you are earning salary, making a living, having work, having a job, going to work every day, etc., what you're really doing, now people can think of this in different ways, and I know people who say that, well, I'm just a slave to my wage. I'm a wage slave. And I would say that's a way to look at it I would respectfully disagree with. I would say a different thing. I would say that when you are engaged in work, you are creating value for other people. That's the basis for someone to pay you a salary, for the value that you create. So what are we here to do, really, in this world, if not to create value for one another? We can do so in a whole bunch of different ways. We can do so simply by listening to other people, but we can also do so by serving them in any capacity, in doing the work that you were hired to do. So that is all of that wraps up in main point number one. And let me move on to main point number 2, and then we can take a 5-minute break. I'm going to park in on main point number 2 at the top of it, at the top of the slide. And then I'll, just like main point number 1, I'll go through the ancient times, the king, the emperor on the left-hand side, and the modern times for you, your spirituality, your life, the meaning in the modern world today, and show you the very straightforward mapping from the ancient times to modern times. Okay, so I think you pretty much know the way that I'm going to present the 3 major points. This is kind of a summary of what we talked about last week. And then, of course, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to have another summary drawing from ideas that we talked about today. Let's cover main point number 2. Okay, so on the left-hand side, once again, we have ancient times. We have the king or the emperor. So what the 2 lines basically talk about, the king meddles with people too much. Now, the people resist. So whenever the king or the emperor passes too many laws, imposes too many rules on people, limiting the people's freedom, this is the situation in point number 2 that occurs. People begin to grow resentful and therefore resistant. They don't want to oppose the king at this point, but they definitely don't like all the limitations that are being placed on them. So this can get into a vicious cycle as well. So remember, you should already be thinking about how this applies in a life pattern for yourself. So the vicious cycle basically means that when the king is interfering with the people's livelihood, the people begin to resist. This causes the king to double down even more that, oh, hey, the people aren't doing exactly what I tell them to do. They are, I suspect that they are not obeying the laws that I am giving them, I'm laying down, so I'm going to meddle even more, and that causes the people to be even more resistant, even more evasive. They figure out ever more creative ways to be outside the law. So that can get into a vicious cycle. Now, just like before, with the taxation, this is not saying that the king should be completely hands-off or the law should be completely absent. There will be chaos, there will be anarchy. There will be, if there's no law enforcement, people will basically do whatever they please. It becomes lawless. It becomes, might makes right. People who are weaker become the victims of people who are stronger. So moderation is that there has to be some kind of role for the rule of law that governs the land. But the moderation is that the king has to govern without excessive interference. And what that means is that you've got to have enough to keep the peace among people, to make sure everyone is following the same rules as everyone else, no one is above the law, and then harmony can prevail when there's not excessive interference, just enough to show that you are aware and that you are concerned, but not excessive interference, not trying to bend people to your will, not trying to change people, which is impossible anyway. So that's ancient times. So now let's guess. I want to challenge everyone before the right side comes up. Can you begin to see what might be on the right-hand side? It's going to be a situation, a life pattern where there's going to be a vicious cycle, and there's also going to be some kind of moderation that will be advised at the bottom of it. And on the top half over here, well, it could be you being meddlesome or interfering with other people. That's a possibility. And the resistance that you encounter could be the resistance from people who don't want to be interfered with, don't want you meddling. That's one possibility, sure. But I also want to challenge everyone to realize one thing. when you meddle, when you interfere, it's because of an attachment you cannot let go of. So why does anyone interfere at all? It's because, well, they are so attached to other people's business, they can't keep their hands off of it. They can't stop themselves. So the overall issue is attachment and the inability to let go of those attachments. It manifests in different ways. So interference is one of them, but you can also look at it in a more general fashion. So focusing just on interference, you keep butting into other people's business, you get in their face about it, you know, it's nothing that really concerns you, it's their own lives, it's their own paths, but you can't keep yourself from butting into it. So what happens is that people dislike and resent your intrusion, so they don't want to openly get into a conflict with you, so they choose to avoid you instead. So this happens frequently in our world. So for instance, if you have a boss who's a backseat driver, who's a micromanager, who are constantly, you know, looking over your shoulders, telling you to do this, do that, stop doing this, stop doing that, well, you know that eventually you're going to begin to figure out ways to minimize the boss's involvement. So when something happens, you probably would be more inclined to withhold the information because you know that if you were to let the boss know, the boss will come up with all kinds of stuff to make your life more complex and more miserable. So that avoidance is the mapping of the resistance of the people, and it gets into a vicious cycle because the more you interfere with someone, the more they avoid you, the more you feel like, gee, I need to do more, I need to meddle even more, interfere even more, and it gets into an increasingly unhappy situation. So the moderation means that this doesn't tell you to take no action whatsoever, to be completely apathetic and passive. At minimum, you have to take action on your own behalf, not to interfere with other people, but to interfere and interrupt your own destructive patterns. So you may be detecting that you are on the same negative path, going down a path that will bring you even more misery and alienation, sadness, pain, etc. If so, you want to interfere with yourself, interrupt your own pattern, and get yourself back on the right track. So that's where action still comes in handy. It doesn't mean that you should do nothing. It means that you should focus on yourself. So this applies to attachments of all kinds. Anytime people cannot let go of a particular attachment, it's time to work on themselves. And let's flip that around. Let's talk about you. Anytime you sense that there are attachments you cannot let go of, it's time to focus on yourself. It's time to work on yourself. It's time to turn your gaze inward and work on yourself internally. Remember that this point becomes important later on. This is basically my attempt to train everyone to detect life patterns that we encounter and be able to identify them in other people and then in yourself. So that there is main point number 2. Let's move on to the last point, main point number 3. So main point number 3 says, the people's disregard for death is due to the glut and the ruler's pursuit of life. So a couple of things to point out here is that the overzealous pursuit of life, the excessive enjoyment of material, physical pleasures, is going to lead to what Lao Tzu calls disregard for death, which you can think of as regarding life itself as not worth living, not meaningful, without purpose. So here's what the left-hand side looks like. So once again, we've got ancient times and we've got the king, the emperor. The king indulges in luxuries too much. So while the people are suffering, remember they are starving, they are resisting the bureaucratic extra regulations, excessive, burdensome regulations. So in that situation, the king is living it up, enjoying, a feast every single day, and this is causing anger. This is arousing anger in the populace. So they become so angry that they disregard death and rebel. So can that be a vicious cycle? Yeah, the more the king is overindulgent, the more angry the people become, and the more likely they are to take up arms against the king. So that can turn into a vicious cycle all by itself. So what is the Tao? What should the king do if not to overindulge? Well, the king has to demonstrate understanding of the people, and that means to understand how people live, understand the difference between those who are royalty, nobility, etc., and the common people. And the king has to demonstrate compassion for the people, which will naturally rein in all that overindulgence, all the luxuries, etc. Okay, so the ancient context is clear enough, but the most important thing is really the modern context. Let's take a look. So the king indulges in luxuries too much. Modern context, you get into physical pleasures. So this can be multifaceted. What I mean by that is that you start getting into physical pleasures, you overeat, you drink too much, you consume all kinds of substances designed to alter your state of mind. All of the above, you get into all kinds of different thrill-seeking behaviors and thrill-seeking activities. This could be the way that this begins, the way that the vicious cycle begins, but it could also be a symptom. Like you feel empty, your spirit is starving, and therefore to make up for that, you seek thrills. Or things are not going really well, there is a pain that you're trying to run away from, you don't really understand it, but the pain is inside of you, so you can't run away anywhere. What do you do instead? You try to numb yourself. You try to self-medicate by running away from yourself, which just means that you are seeking physical sensations that will take your mind off the pain that you feel inside. So, like I said, this is multifaceted. It's one thing that Lao Tzu is talking about, but it fits with multiple scenarios. So what happens when you get into the physical pleasures too much is invariable. You become jaded. You've had too much. You don't really want anymore. It's making you sick, but then you can't stop yourself. You go back for more. And this causes you to lose interest in life, which is the corresponding mapping to disregard death. So when you regard life, death lightly, it also means that you regard life lightly. If death is no longer something to be afraid of, it also means, on the flip side, in our modern experience, it means that life is not worth living. Life can be not worth living, not necessarily because of anger, although that is entirely possible. It could be because of the overindulgence, the numbness, and the emptiness that just won't go away. So, what is the Tao? Well, you have to switch gears. Rather than to find pleasures in overindulgence, instead, you have to find joy in the little things in life and living the simple life. Now, when I say little things, I mean that very literally, and little things are like happening all the time, everywhere. When Bill began talking, he mentioned that he noticed this beautiful caterpillar, and that's a great little thing to take joy. It really lifted his mood. He's enjoying how beautiful, how gorgeous that animal is, and by extension, how beautiful the totality of creation is. Another little thing is to have a visit from a friend that you haven't seen in a very long time. Okay? It's not a huge thing. It's not like a, physical type of pleasure, a material kind of pleasure, but it's the happiness that goes to the core of your being. That's a little thing. And even inconsequential little things, things that other people take for granted. And I'll give you one example. When I am driving and I am approaching, a cross street, and the lights are green, and I get to drive right through. Everyone will take that for granted, but for me, that is such a cool little thing. All right, I just made it right through. Didn't have to wait. Little things in life, and living the simple life, rather than to have all these different pursuits, to live life more simply, to be able to appreciate everything more, to let go of the clutter in your life so that you have less and less. These are the recipes for the Tao life. So by this point, I think everyone has a pretty good idea about main point number 1, main point number 2, main point number 3. So now I want to tell everyone the secrets of applying the Tao, not just for the 3 points, not just for this chapter, but for every single chapter of the Tao Te Ching. And this is something that almost never gets talked about. The sages, when they look at the Tao Te Ching, they know how to apply it. They have an intuitive understanding of the secrets of the Tao. Most people will spend too much time on the meaning of this word or that and lose the deeper context or the essence of the meaning. So let me try to make sure that we don't fall into that trap. What do I mean by all that? Well, let's take a look. By the way, I should explain what I mean by meta points. And if you think you know what meta point means, please feel free to type it out. So whenever I talk about meta anything, a meta point is there's a term in computers called metadata. Metadata is data about data. Okay, that's confusing, right? So here's what I mean. You have this amount of data. So I'll ask you, well, how much data do you have? And you might say, well, I have a gigabyte's worth of data. Well, that piece of information, a gigabyte's worth of data, that's data. It's data about data. It's information about information. So here, a meta point is a point about the points. Okay? Very meta. So the 3 main points that I have talked about, now I'm going to make 2 points about them. 2 points about the 3 points. They're meta points. So that's what the secrets of the Tao are going to be, meta points. So let's take a look at meta point number 1. Number 1, the Tao operates at a transcendental level of oneness. What does that even mean? Okay. People who are, philosophy majors, they'll look at that, they will nod knowingly. Very profound, very deep. Yeah, I see what you're doing. I see where you're going. I see what you're trying to say. Really? Okay. Now let me be very clear exactly what I'm trying to say. The Tao, you already know that there's a lot of talk about oneness. Oneness is unity. A lot of times, we, like people who are new to the Tao, they like this joke about Zen. The Zen hot dog vendor, the hot dog stand. And the joke is that, the customer goes to the hot dog vendor and says, make me one with everything. So you can interpret that in 2 different ways. Make me one with everything. Make me a hot dog with the relish, the ketchup, the mustard, all the fillings, all the toppings, everything. Make me one with everything. The other interpretation of that line, make me one with everything, is in the spiritual context. I feel in a deep level of meditation, I am one with everything. Make me one with everything. So the oneness, that oneness is what I'm talking about here, but I'm being very serious and very, very literal. And, people devise a follow-up joke to the joke in that, the customer pays for it, but is expecting some change and says, where's my change? And the hot dog vendor says, change comes from within. That's a follow-up joke to make me one with everything. But let's continue with the theme of oneness. When I'm very serious about oneness, what I mean is that ultimately, the essence that is within you is one with the essence of the universe. That sounds good on the surface, but the serious implication of that, when you are at a very high level of cultivation, very advanced level, is that you can literally see the truth of it. You can see the truth that the essence within myself is exactly the same essence that is within someone else. That someone else may be a friend, maybe a loved one, or maybe an enemy, a tormentor that I have, someone who's a critic, good or bad, all are one. And if you are able to see other people as sharing the exact same essence as yourself, that changes the game. It changes the game because suddenly you want to treat other people, whether they are good or bad to you, you want to treat them with the same kindness, the same allowance that you would give to yourself. That's easier said than done because you know and I know that there's some people out there that just really get under your skin, and there's no way that you can treat them with the same allowance, the same kindness, the same latitude that you would give to yourself. Not easy at all. If you can do that, then you've become the Buddha. So this oneness is also why I say that in the examples of the Tao Te Ching, every chapter, this chapter is one example of it, but it's the same with every chapter. When I talk about the king, when I talk about the subject, someone is asking, well, what are you exactly? Which side are you? Are you on the side of the king or are you on the side of the subjects? And I will say, yes, just like the sages would. And I say that because ultimately, I am everything. Ultimately, you are everything. So you must have the fluidity of mind to understand the distinction and the lack thereof between yourself and others. And when I say distinction, I also mean separation. So the sixth, that there's no true separation. When you are at the advanced level, you really understand reality as it is. There's no true separation between you and the next person, whoever that person may be. So there are no racial boundaries, no separation in terms of geography or ethnic background. We are all simply one. In that state, it is not possible for you to be discriminating against anyone. You will be discriminating yourself. In our example, it means that you have to place yourself with the fluidity of mind to see yourself as, I'm the king of my own life. And that same fluidity would also lead you to say that, well, if I do X, Y, Z, I'm the subjects of the kingdom that are affected by myself, who is also the king. Confusing enough? Now, let me explain that the deeper level, the transcendental level, is something that we all have direct experience of. Here's the next bullet. This is also profound, and if you haven't looked into the subject, this may be new to you. This line says, think dream analysis. Why do I say that? Well, that's because when people look into dreams and try to analyze, well, what did I dream this? What did I dream that? What does that mean? What does it say about me, etc.? An important point in dream analysis is that no matter who it is that you dream, in your dream, it's an aspect of you. So everyone that you see in your dream is an aspect of you, or you in disguise. So think about what that also implies about life. So the person who cuts you off on the freeway, leading you into road rage, well, think of that as an aspect of you. Easy? No, not easy at all. Ultimately true? Yes. That fundamental oneness is how the Tao works, and it's also the reason why when you walk the path of the Tao, you begin to see all kinds of bizarre things. Like, how can this be that I am XYZ and I haven't heard from this person for so many years, and suddenly I'm thinking about him or her, and you know, the phone rings and it's that person. What are the odds? So a fundamental truth is that everything looks strange until you realize the connection between them. Then it's not so strange. Then it's like, of course. Of course it will show up that way. Of course it makes perfect sense because of the connection. So the this joke that I heard about this person, you know, at a bar who's who's overhearing a conversation between two men. So the first man says, so you know, buddy, I'm originally from Ireland, and the second man says, you are? No way, I am too. I'm also from Ireland. And the first man says, oh, well, I'm from, you know, this city, Dublin. How about you? And the other guy is like, wow, no way, me too. And the first guy is like, well, I lived on this particular street, you know, what part of town did you live in? And second guy says, I lived on that street, you know. And the first man is like, well, this is way too amazing. This is such a coincidence. I went to this elementary school not too far away. And the second man is like, yeah, that's exactly where I went, you know. So they went further down in the conversation. Both men went to the same school, had the same set of teachers, knew the same people from the same neighborhood, and they're just like, you know, they're drinking, and they're just totally amazed at these coincidences between them. So the person that's overhearing this conversation turns to the bartender, and says, is this just not the most amazing coincidence that you are hearing? And the barkeep says, oh, that's just the McGallagher brothers. They always get that way when they're drunk. When they're drunk, they forget that they are brothers who came from the same place, same family, same school, same friends, same neighbors, and they're marveling at each other. What? No way, me too. So it's a similar situation when you have people separated at birth, but you know, like identical twins, they go on having the same experiences in life. Later on, they encounter one another, and they discover, much to their amazement, that they have such similarities in life, and then they realize that, oh, we're identical twins, and of course, there's a connection. So just like the two drunk men, they have that connection of being from the same place. All the things that you notice that are strange and bizarre as you cultivate the path of the Tao is due to the connection of the oneness. When you see the connection, it's not that bizarre anymore. It's not that strange anymore. It becomes like, oh, of course that's the way it is. Of course it should happen that way. So, very tough pill to swallow that you and your worst enemy are one and the same, sharing the same essence of the Tao. But if you can ever master that particular lesson, you will find that you become a more understanding and more compassionate person. So in that same perspective, you will, when you look at that, when you use that to look at the Tao Te Ching, it's never the same again, because when you look at all the different examples, you know, the warrior, the soldier, the general, the philosopher, the teacher, the sage, they're all aspects of you. Or to be even more direct and blunt, they're all you. And you are them. You are in the process of uncovering them within yourself. So that's what I'm talking about by transcendental. It's a trip. So look at the Tao Te Ching that way. It'll never seem quite the same again. So meta point number 2. This one I think is easier. The Tao is about universal life patterns. So it's the same whether you're talking about the Tao Te Ching or Zhuangzi or I Ching. They're all the same. They're all pointing out these different life patterns that if you understood them, you will be able to see and identify the life patterns for yourself. And then you can look ahead to see what's next. What is the next thing that the life pattern will bring for you? And the funny thing is, when you listen to other people with this understanding, then you begin to, depending on how well you understand the Tao, you begin to, oh, what they're talking about now, that's this pattern that I have read about, that I have thought about, I have understood. And you can tell more and more about them without getting to know them for years and years, and they will be amazed at the insights that you can provide for them. Okay, so you see that pattern everywhere and in everyone, in every event, every circumstance, when you grasp the patterns of the Tao. So people will sometimes tell me, well, you know, I consult the I Ching, I cast the coins, and then what it tells me is like incredible, like it's right on the money. How can that be? It's just a book. I'm just throwing a couple of coins. Well, it makes more sense in conjunction with these 2 meta points. There's the oneness, and there's the universal life patterns. So of course it's gonna have that eerie similarity to what you are experiencing. What you're going through is one of the patterns that's already been identified. If you master the patterns, you master your life. Okay, so here's the big challenge for everybody today. Remember the 3 major points, point 1, point 2, point 3, and then remember the 2 meta points, the 2 points about the 3 points, the 2 meta points. And now I'm going to use an example to show exactly what I mean by the secrets of the Tao. Here's the example. There's an actor. He was really big in the 80s. I don't know about today. He may not be that well known, but his name, Dolph Lundgren. He made it. He was a huge star in 1985 when Rocky IV came out. Rocky IV was a major hit. Dolph Lundgren played this a huge monster, this giant, this villain in that movie. His name was Drago. He is like the most perfect athlete ever trained. And, you know, he fought against Sylvester Stallone, Rocky Balboa, and the contrast between the 2 men is that, well, Dolph Lundgren is like 6'5". He's a really tall guy. He's extremely muscular. So, a gifted athlete. And so I remember when that movie first came out, I was 21 years old. And like all young men at the time, I thought, wow, this guy, Dolph Lundgren, he's got a phenomenal future ahead of him as an action star. You know, he's never going to have to worry about finding work again because he seems like perfect for that. As a man, he seems to have absolutely everything. He's got the physique, he's got the height, he's got the looks, he's got the skills. He's a karate champion. He's an extremely smart guy. He was head of his class in chemical engineering, got a scholarship to MIT. Just an incredible human being. Little did I suspect the truth, the underlying truth behind the reality. Since the 80s, he hasn't been heard from all that much. He played in a lot of movies. In fact, it was like 40 different movies. These movies have not made it big at all. He did not enjoy another big hit in the 90s after Rocky IV. Now, after all these years, he was another blip on my radar, so I discovered that he did a talk. He gave a speech in TED Talk, and I was very interested in finding out more about what he's been up to. So, to give you an idea, here's the actor on stage at that particular TED Talk, and he revealed a difficult life, a life that I never would have suspected. As a 21-year-old young man watching Rocky IV, I would not, in a million years at the time I would not have suspected that he would go on to have the life that he actually did. So today, here's what he says, and I want to quote him verbatim. If you were to look up his talk, you will see him saying the exact words I'm about to present to you right now. And just imagine how shocked I was upon hearing these words from him, because I had thought, as a 21-year-old guy, I had thought that this man, this actor, he's got everything. The world was his oyster. But here's what he says. He said, drinking, sexual affairs, overeating, violence, you name it. I did a lot of bad things to myself. And 25 years later, 40 movies later, yeah, I was a movie star, but I was miserable most of the time. I had a failed marriage, 2 daughters whom I love, but they didn't even know me. My career was kind of rock bottom. Wow, really? So what caused all of that? How can it be that someone who seemed to be on top of the world, who seemed to have everything, would fall, would have a life like this? A life that I don't think that any person would envy. Well, there's a primary cause, which I'm going to get to. However, looking at this particular paragraph here that he says, I want to challenge everyone to connect it with one of the 3 major points. So, was it point number 1, point number 2, or point number 3? Was it spiritual starvation? Was it interference and resistance? Or was it overindulgence and life losing its value and meaning and purpose for him? If you say number 3, you are absolutely correct. See how easily this connects and maps into main point number 3. The overindulgence at the top of the paragraph here, the loss of meaning, the misery, the sheer misery of it all. That's a life pattern right there. And he's probably not the only person who's gone through that particular life pattern. The only unexpected rare thing is that he's actually standing on stage telling us all about it. Wow. So, what was the primary cause? We've identified this particular slide with one of the powerful life patterns that Lao Tzu is describing. So let's move on. The primary cause, as he relates and reveals a very intimate part about himself on stage, is that he went through a childhood suffering much abuse at the hands of his father. And that abuse, that experience, that became a painful and persistent attachment. something he could not let go of. It's like a trauma. It's like post-traumatic stress syndrome. So what happens when you have an attachment you cannot let go of? Well, one way that the attachment can show up is that you can let go of the need to control other people, so you meddle, you interfere in other people. That's not the case for this particular actor. However, he had an attachment of a different kind, and it had the same effect on him, a similar life pattern. That is, his life became increasingly difficult to manage. So remember, in the original metaphor, it was about how the people became difficult to govern. So for him, this is basically saying that his life was hard to manage, that he wanted to do better and become more successful as an actor, as an entertainer, but somehow it just did not work out. It was hard. So as I said, the attachment can manifest as an inability to stop meddling. That's not the case for him. The case for him was that it showed up as an inner trauma that caused him to sabotage himself. So that's why he had a failed marriage. It was a symptom of this problem, this trauma that he had internally. That's why he ended up not really knowing the daughters that he loved. When you have children that grow up as a result of a broken marriage, a divorce, one of the consequences is that they don't get to bond with the parents as they otherwise would. Okay, so let's keep it moving. So we've identified the primary cause, an attachment, a very painful attachment from childhood as a result of abuse. What is the solution? Well, in this particular chapter, the solution is highlighted as being spiritual in nature. The only way to solve a problem like that, indeed, ultimately, the only way to solve any problem is to turn inward, work on oneself, and cultivate spirituality. So people who care about him have suggested this. They have said that, well, listen, perhaps you should go through therapy, perhaps you should meditate, but initially he scoffed at it. He didn't think that it was going to work for him. And if you think about this in terms of mapping to the major 3 points, major point number 1 is about how you have to feed and sustain the spirit. If you overlook the spirit, if you neglect the spirit, you have spiritual starvation, you are lacking spiritual sustenance, and you will never be able to heal up properly from the attachment or from the trauma. So his initial reaction was this: resistance. Meditation? Do I look like an Indian guru? I don't think so. Now people laugh when he says that because this guy is 6'5", muscular and so forth. Certainly not what you picture, what one would picture as an Indian guru. But lucky for him, he eventually relented. He eventually decided that, well, got nothing to lose. I've gone down the negative path so many times. I've messed up my own life so many times. What have I got to lose? So he decided to do all of the above, turn inward, work on himself, and cultivate spirituality. And here's the result. He says, on stage, it totally changed my life. Suddenly, this fog I was living in lifted. So that's what happens when you turn inward. That's what happens when you feed the spirit, give it spiritual sustenance, make it become strong, heal it. That's when you have the ability to in turn become better and provide a healing to other people, provide forgiveness for the people who have wronged you, and to help people who cannot help themselves. You may have those ideals. Yeah, I want to be an asset to society. I want to help people who cannot help themselves. Well, you really can't. You can't do that until you have turned inward and make sure you take care of all the issues that you already have. Heal up yourself, let go of your attachments, then you become the spiritually powerful person who is capable of really helping other people. For him, he has settled on a particular cause. He, upon healing himself, and he reached out to the people. He's done a lot of bad things. He sought their forgiveness. He spoke with his ex-wife, and he asked her for her forgiveness. He connected with his daughters. He took ownership of the problems that he had caused himself. He asked for their forgiveness. And his father is gone, but he forgave his father. And he forgave his father for what his father did, and he forgave his mother for what she did not do, protect him. And with that, he became a transformed individual. So there are many kinds of transformations. Death is one kind of transformation. A spiritual transformation that you undergo while living, that's another kind. And the butterfly can stand in place for that as well, can represent that as well. He became a stronger person. He has now the ability to do something about the world's problems, at least some of it. So he wrote a movie. He wrote a script for a movie. Remember, this is a smart guy. This is a very intelligent man. He wrote a movie called Skin Trade. And it's an action movie. It's about human trafficking. Human trafficking is a huge problem in the world today. It's pretty much behind the scenes. So people don't realize what a big problem it is. But there are millions of people around the world today who are engaged in that. It's billions of dollars of business. It's an industry. People are sold essentially into slavery. And it's not just a problem in third world countries. When he gave this talk, he was in Santa Monica, and he lives over there. It's my old stomping grounds. And he says he himself has seen this example of human trafficking where someone was being kept as a slave, where? Not in a third world country, in Brentwood, which is not that far away from Santa Monica. It was just a few blocks away from where I used to live. So it's a woman by the name of Alice who's being kept essentially as a slave, brought in from another country, her passport taken away, her mobility, her freedom of choice severely limited, under guard all the time, working like a slave for a wealthy family. So because of his involvement, one day FBI agents showed up at this mansion in Brentwood and approached this woman, Alice, says, what would you like to do? What do you want to do? Want to stay here, or do you want to leave? She chose to leave slavery behind. She chose to leave her prison. So he was able to do something indirectly that benefited another human being. In a stark contrast to the misery that he used to feel as a movie star, he says, this was the greatest feeling in the world. So he found the joy that's abundant when you live the Tao life. So that is the example that I want to share with everyone. And I hope that you have developed an idea for yourself on how to map the different life patterns in the Tao Te Ching to different aspects of life. Your own life and other people's life. Everything you see and hear can be part of the overall grand, majestic, beautiful pattern of life. We're now ready to do the paraphrase of 75 and bring this chapter to an end. So here we go. 75, to start with, we've got once again, point number one, the people's hunger is due to the excess of their rulers' taxation, so they starve. How would we paraphrase that with modern language? Here's what I offer. In life, when you overtax yourself with material concerns and overlook your spiritual needs, you begin to affect the quality of your life. This is not unlike a ruler taxing the people excessively, so they end up starving. Okay, let's continue on. Point number two, the people's difficulty in being governed is due to the meddling of their ruler, so they are difficult to govern. How will we depict that in modern language? So once again, here's what I would offer. Similarly, when you are unable to let go of your attachments, you find life increasingly difficult to manage. This is not unlike a ruler meddling with the people excessively, so they start resisting and become difficult to govern. So there you go. With the paraphrase, we're able to include both the ancient and the modern contexts. Let's go on to number three. The people's disregard for death is due to the glut in the ruler's pursuit of life. So they disregard death. And here's what I would say. In general, if you go overboard in your material pursuits, you end up with less joy in life. Eventually, you hit rock bottom, like the people living in misery, while the ruler consumes luxuries. They no longer fear death and rise up. So, let me pause for a moment and say that I wrote this paraphrase long before I heard the talk from Dolph Lundgren. I did not know at the time that I wrote this that he would be using the exact same words that I'm using now. And remember, when it comes to the oneness of the Tao, what you do is affecting yourself, therefore you are both the ruler and the subjects. So he talked about his career being rock bottom. Eventually you hit rock bottom. That's exactly what I wrote. He talked about being miserable. I talk about people living in misery. And the consumption of luxuries for him was the seeking of endless physical thrills that basically caused him to regard life and death lightly. It didn't have the same value or meaning to him anymore. Eventually, he had to rise up. He had to bring about a change in his life, which is to turn inward and become a more spiritual person. So here we are at the conclusion, at the concluding two lines of 75. Therefore, those who do not strive for living are better than those who value living. It's going to sound odd unless you know exactly what Lao Tzu meant. So here's the paraphrase. The above gives us an insight. Those who do not live excessively end up much better off than those who value life so much that they kill themselves chasing after it. Consider the irony. Oh, I really love life. I want to enjoy everything in life. You kill yourself pursuing all the physical sensations. That's not the Tao. The Tao, simple life, lasting joy, the greatest feeling in the world. Okay, so we are now at the end of 75. So I've prepared some additional stuff and going into 76 also, but I think we can save them for next time. So for now, let me jump to the end of my presentation. So there are many different ways to cultivate spirituality. Some may choose to cultivate by themselves. and perhaps by reading books, participate in a meeting like this, and contemplation, meditation on their own. That's an honorable path to follow. The most important thing about different paths is whether or not it is suitable for you. If that is a suitable path for you, more power to you. For other people, the suitable path may be a more spiritually oriented path like what the Guan Dao offers. So for those people that hear the calling of this particular path, the path of Guan Dao cultivation, I would encourage you to get in touch with me. I know that I'm going to do whatever I can to be of service to you to try to make things happen. And even if you live in a place where there's no Guan Dao shrine nearby, perhaps together we can make something happen. So get in touch with me, and we'll see what we can do. So here's the summary that I want to offer to everyone. The last summary, inspired by 75. What are some additional insights we can take away from this chapter? So here's what I would offer. Number one, apply moderation in material pursuits. And I say money has a bad rap because you hear, money is the root of all evil, etc. Rather than to think of money that way, in a negative context, in a negative light, I want you to start thinking of money as the measure of energy that we exchange in our interactions. So, bottom line, we still have to make a living by providing value to others. Emphasis on providing value. Are you providing value? If so, then you deserve to make a living. Number two, identify your attachments. So just like Dolph Lundgren, he was able to identify his attachments. He knew what his problem was. It was the fear, the rage, the pain of childhood abuse. Now, everybody's attachments can be dramatically different. So my question for you is, what are yours? Are you able to identify all of your attachments? The more you can do so, the more you can avoid having them drag you down again and again. So it becomes another life pattern that you have to overcome. And you do that by first recognizing, acknowledging, identifying what those attachments are. Lastly, point number three, there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's hope for everybody. There's salvation, if you will. There's real abundant joy, and it can be easily found in living the Tao life. So it's a life of moderation and meaning. It's a life of simplicity and service. All of these things are important. Moderation, because you need the balance. Meaning, so you would see life for the incredible, miraculous value that it truly is. Simplicity, so you don't have the chaos and complexity to weigh you down. And service, ultimately, that's what it's all about. We're all here in service of one another. This brings us to an end of our meeting today. We are exactly on time. Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂，持架三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架规则是一鞠躬，接班一鞠躬。Okay, everybody, we are done.